my presentation is that there are a lot of channels and instruments at play, which we might not directly see, and especially, and here I'm referring to Germany and the German discussion currently. Policymakers might underestimate the transfer activities from public research organizations to industry if they only focus, for example, on patents or on spin-offs. And I will show you some data on that. It doesn't work. Maybe the mouse. It doesn't work. Oh, no. Okay. So there is, maybe not all of you are familiar with the German research landscape, so I briefly introduce that and then point also out where Fraunhofer is located in that landscape. So we have, for the non-university research organizations at least, what I would call a mission orientation, or a division of labor with a certain focus on certain tasks. And this also results then on very different, I would call, instruments that you can expect from which will be at play by these organizations beyond IPR. So here a brief introduction then to the German research landscape. We have industry that is, of course, mostly privately funded and does applied research, whereas we have also, and this is here the main axis from my point of view, the difference between basic and applied, where we have Max Planck, Leibniz, which are really more basic research oriented. We have the universities and the universities of applied sciences somewhere in between, but Fraunhofer, of course, more, and this is our mission, doing applied research. And the interesting part here is on the other axis that we are also partly privately funded. So only 1/3 of our budget is institutional funding, whereas the others have almost 100% in these cases, or 50% or more in the case of Helmholtz, and definitely also in the case of universities. So, and 50% of these 2/3 that we have to acquire from the market are from industry, essentially. So we're talking about roughly 600 to 800 million euro per year that we have to acquire from industry. And therefore we need to find someone who really pays us for our research and is interested in. This is then on the output side of the German research landscape. So I showed you the funding, and here's the output then at the end. So you have publications here per 1,000 employees, and here the patents. And what you see is Fraunhofer is rather patent intensive, but publication not so strong. And Max Planck is essentially the other way around, and the others are somewhere in between. So this is the output side. Of course, Fraunhofer has a lot of patents, but in relation to the others, but maybe not so many publications. So the non-university research organizations, they are organized, or they are funded via the so-called Pact for Research and Innovation, which is that the federal states and the central government, they jointly fund the institutional part, so the institutional funding of these. And in exchange, they have to monitor their activities. And now in the phase that just started in 2021 and lasts to 2030, they gave themselves a focus on transfer, and they designed these transfer instruments that they want to look at. I would say these are even not complete. I have a much broader picture on that, what could be instruments for transfer and what are essentially really in use, not only for Fraunhofer, but for all the others. I make a little bit of distinction between who's responsible here for making this transfer happen, but I don't want to go too much into detail into that. But what we see here is also a differentiation between basic and applied, or basic research and markets or commercialization. And there might be a lot of things, and IPR is only one of them. Of course, we have co-patents also that Jan just mentioned, but there are a lot of other instruments at play. We had the standards before, but what I would also point out is joint projects, of course, then also contract research, what Fraunhofer's business at the end is in this respect, but of course also co-publications, which are really an important transfer channel. Maybe also focusing on certain industries, especially in pharmaceuticals and chemicals, but also others. Okay, so there's a broad array of instruments we should look at. But even if you look at patents, then we might miss some, because there is and this is what Jan was referring to, those which are filed by the universities or the public research organizations. But maybe those which are based on knowledge coming out of these are much more. And I can show you a little bit data on that. I mean, there has been a groundbreaking publication by Patrick and colleagues a couple of years ago, but we picked up on that and tried now to make a broader comparison. And here is the shares of university. I'm only talking about university patents here because of the international comparison. The share of, and these are EPO patents, the share of university patents per country. You see Spain is rather high, France is at a medium level, Italy, Austria, and Germany at a lower level. So of about 3% here. But these are only the ones that are filed by them. When we look at the number of and shares of academic patents, this is where essentially the university knowledge has was flowing in. These are completely different numbers, and then the shares are much higher. Forget about 2018 because these are EPO patents only. So in 18, when we did it last September, these were incomplete. So look at 17 data. So then the shares are much higher. We're talking about 15% in France. We're talking about 5-6% in Germany, and in even more than that in a couple of other countries. So when we only look at the ones that are filed by universities, we miss really a considerable share, in some countries more and others less. The interesting thing now is who files these patents. And it is indeed, so academic patents includes those which are filed, but also those which are invented by universities. And when we see this, and this is definitely an effect, for example, here in Germany on the professor's privilege, the abolishment, of course, an increasing share by universities, but we can see this also by other countries. But there is, of course, also a high share of, for example, large enterprises or SMEs directly filing these patents. So we're not talking about licensing, we're talking about ownership. In France, this green bar is definitely large because of CNRS and the effects here. So it's a little bit different, but the trend is also clearly visible here. So it's more publicly owned. I don't know if this is really what we should aim for, but that's maybe for the discussion, open for the discussion. So then IP-based and knowledge-based spin-offs. So when we talk about spin-offs, and very often spin-offs that are reported are the IP-based. So if I have a patent and then we spin off a company, that's a good spin-off. What about the others? Again, the knowledge question is there. So we matched the founders database with authors database and identified with a certain probability spin-offs that come out of public research. And first here, this is the official numbers with the IP, and then you see CNRS 273, of course, not exclusively by CNRS. We have Fraunhofer 81 in this 3-year period. When we do that per researcher, then we see it's rather an equal distribution with some outstanding ones. We could talk about them in detail, but in principle, there is a certain output generated on the IP basis. But now, when we again look at those which are knowledge-based, the numbers are much higher. And I only have data for Germany here, unfortunately, but the principle is what I'm interested in here. So the numbers, of course, are much higher because universities are really big institutional, and they have a lot of capacities, of course. But these are the numbers we're talking about then in terms of knowledge spin-offs. So 3,000 almost in these 3-year periods. And then when we compare them for these organizations, it's really a reasonable number that we miss if we only look at the IP-based spin-offs. Again, interesting is who, not who files, but where are these companies located? And several of them are in the service sector, especially in ICT services or in other knowledge-intensive services. I mean, R&D-intensive manufacturing, other manufacturing, and maybe other technical services. Patents might play a certain role, but for the others, it's almost not possible to file patents. But still, there is knowledge that transfers into a company. Now, this is my last part. Now, focus on the Fraunhofer and the impact of the Fraunhofer society, so all the institutes, on the German on the German GDP, on German economy. We have done 2 studies. One really where we have a macro effect, and we estimated that, and we say, okay, it's a knowledge-generating organization, and we are a knowledge-using and innovative country. So there is definitely a value to that, and it's really considerable. Our president, Fraunhofer president, is very proud of that, saying, okay, what we estimate is a 1 to 21 investment to GDP return, so to say. That's really considerable. But what is, from my point of view, even more interesting is what our partners, collaborating partners, really have or benefit from the collaboration. And we have 2 ways of collaborating, mainly in that respect. The one is direct in contract research, and the other one is in joint research, so publicly funded joint research activities. And concerning the joint research projects, we have roughly 6,000 running in 2021, and 5 out of 6 of these were with companies involved. So also here, knowledge is transferred. It's, as my picture showed at the beginning, most often, and it has to, because we didn't really talk about European regulation, but it has to be far away from the market, because public funding cannot really go into market activities. But there's definitely a transfer of knowledge also to companies. And here is now the project, the contract research and the project money. So we also see an increase. This is in constant prices. We also see an increase in that respect. Of course, Fraunhofer was growing in the same time. So obviously there is a demand by industry. And when we look who is really, who are the partners, and we have here the contract research on the left-hand side, it is 2/3 are SMEs. And if we even have the German Mittelstand's definition up to 5,000, it's really a small fraction that is large industry. And when we have joint projects, it's even more obvious. So it's really an SME that benefit. And this is now my last slide on that respect. So there is definitely an impact. And the point is that really also an economic effect for these companies can be shown. So when they collaborate with Fraunhofer, they have a higher EBIT, they have usually more turnover, and usually they are also growing in the long run. I mean, the selection discussion we can have from econometric perspectives, but we control for that. So to summarize and conclude, so there are much more transfer channels than just IPR-based, or even only the obvious ones, I would say, that policymakers often focus on. And if we only focus on IPR, then we definitely underestimate the effects of this transfer. What is really important is that some channels are more relevant for depending on the mission of the organization. Jan pointed out that also the technologies play a certain role. In some areas it's more important, for example, in chemistry, as he mentioned, and in others maybe less. That's also an important dimension. And then, of course, we have other transfer channels that really should be taken into account. So really, and this is my last sentence, transfer should not be seen as an act of just handing things over, as also Jan put it, buying something from the shelf, but as a process. And therefore, the earlier the collaboration starts, maybe not immediately with a commercialization directly in mind, but the earlier the exchange starts, the better might be the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer, for your presentation. With a German perspective, even though there were some data on Europe, and about the collaborative aspects is very important. One of the interesting points I just want to raise before giving the floor to Stefan is those story about knowledge-based startups, which without IP. And that's probably one of the fields where we are underestimating quite a lot what is happening around. And in particular, you did not mention, but I just want to add that, is the fact that we have a lot of students which are doing this type of transfer, and we basically don't see them in the statistics. I mean, and university in particular are also training institutions, and we should not fully or completely